the need for conversation design doesn't go away. It shifts.
The good news is we made it very easy for people to build bots. The bad news is we made it really easy for people to build really bad bots very quickly.
It stands to reason that creating effective bot to human conversations is not an easy task.
The goal is not to have the most natural conversation or anything. The goal is to use elements of natural conversation to make it easy for someone to achieve their goals.
When it comes to just managing complexity, like there's just no avoiding that, I think, in any organization.
Welcome to Unprompted, a conversation series by Conversation Design Institute where we explore the craft, the practice, and the future of conversational AI with the people shaping it. I'm Hans Verdam, CEO at CDI, and today I'm speaking with Grace Hughes, a seasoned leader in conversation design space and currently Conversation Design Director at Accenture Song. Grace brings a rare blend of storytelling instincts and enterprise strategy, from prototyping voice assistants for theme parks to launching large-scale conversational systems in the enterprise. Her career reflects just how far and how fast this field is evolving. We'll explore how Grace thinks about designing for trust in the age of large language models, what it takes to build a center of excellence of conversation design in a global consulting firm, and why scripting is only the start of what makes a designer great. So, Grace, let's get into it straight away. It's great to have you here. We've known each other for many years. So in those many years, I want to know, what is a belief about conversational AI that you recently had to change?
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for having me, Hans. I guess one thing, I'm not sure that I've had to kind of radically change my thinking, but something that has been two things that have become much clearer for me in the last kind of 18 months or so are that for to create great conversational experiences, we not only need conversation designers. I'm very passionate about the discipline of conversation design, but we need all design disciplines to be involved. We need the service designers, we need the business designers, we need the visual designers to really elevate these experiences. So I think for many years, perhaps the broader design community didn't really see that they had a part to play in the creation of, bots and voice assistants. But I think that that is changing now broadly across the industry. And I think that that's a really, really good thing. So that's one thing. I think something else that I've realized, and maybe it's obvious to other designers, but what I found in recent projects is that we can be really focused on creating an MVP, um, we need focus and we need discipline to get there. But we also, with our clients across the team, need to be thinking about the future vision in parallel, so that it informs the work that we're doing in the early stages of a project or a program. So I think that that's something that it has really been demonstrated in the work that I've done recently. Yeah.
I really like that. And I think you're touching on a few things that we'll get back to later, because I think what you're saying in a way is that conversational AI is becoming more important and it's elevated in the organization. And to do a good job, we need more people to buy into it and develop a big vision for it. We need to bring in more designers. But with that, you're also adding layers of complexity. And so it's like, to make it good, we need more and better people around it. But
Yeah.
if we bring all those people, we create new challenges. And we're going to touch on that later when we talk about what it's like to build, a center of excellence in a large, complex organization like Accenture.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, I agree. Definitely more complexity, but um for the greater good, I would say.
that's good. Yeah. And then, as you're doing this now, and we always said you've been doing this for a while, how did you get into this initially? Did you start also at an adjacent design discipline and then found your way in, or what's the story?
Yes, I did. So I joined Accenture. It's gonna be 9 years this November.
Wow.
So a long time, but it's gone super quickly. And I started in the dock, which is one of Accenture's innovation centers. I had an amazing 5 or 6 years there working with a really great design team. I was working as a content designer there, as well as technologists, strategists. And that's where, by chance, I got into conversation design. There was a project happening where a team of engineers were creating a voice assistant for like a rapid prototyping space. And they brought me in really to kind of like put a presentation together to tell the story of
Really?
what they were creating. And I saw what they were doing and the kind of conversation that they were trying to create. And I thought, that's interesting. I would prefer to focus on that, maybe, or do that as well as the kind of the storytelling. So that's where it really started with that project 7 years ago, I think. And I realized that actually this was an area where we needed content designers. And I very much
Mm.
see conversation design as being under the umbrella of content design. But that was the start, and I began to explore this field and to start to establish a conversation design discipline, and the thinking around this with a research project in the doc called The Future of Conversation. And that was really, really interesting and gave me like a really good foundation as to the considerations that we should have around
Yeah.
conversation design, the people that needed to be involved, the kind of mental models that people have when they engage with these systems, and the idea that we need designers, we need creatives to be involved in this process of creating these experiences. It's not just for technologists alone. So then, a couple of kind of a year or two after that, I joined an EMEA team, like a European team, which was solely focused on creating this craft and center of excellence around conversation design. And I've been doing that ever since, and through various changes, both within Accenture, but then, of course, with the technology, with generative AI coming on the scene. Um, but yeah, it all started in the doc many years ago, and that's brought me to where I am today.
That's right. Yeah. Also, as you were talking, I remember like I think the first time we ever had a talk, it was like, I'm starting this thing within in the within the group. And it was like this big moment of conversation that we were so happy for
Yeah.
Accenture to sort of build this whole practice around it. And it was
Yeah,
really
because
like, wow.
this is a relatively new discipline. People are really hungry to learn and to gain knowledge, and the Conversation Design Institute was one of the first places to go to get that knowledge. And then obviously, you learn by doing too. So you learn
Yeah.
on projects, you learn from others, but um yeah, like this is people are definitely eager to get the knowledge and to upskill.
Yeah, and now it's changing again, right? And that's the fascinating part about it. So what do you think then now about your what's the big shift that you've kind of seen if you compare your work to maybe from 2 years ago to now even, or maybe even do like 4 to and
Yeah.
today?
I mean, the obvious shift is the move from more rules-based dialogues where conversation designers are creating bot responses from scratch, perhaps, to these systems now where we can leverage large language models. So obviously that's been a massive, massive shift that we started to grapple with, towards the end of 2022 and 2023. And I remember Unparsed, the Conversation Design Festival in 2023. It was really interesting because people were kind of a little bit, you know, well, I won't say shell shocked, but just kind of trying to
Mm.
figure out, okay, where does conversation design go now that we have these systems that create content? Like, what happens to us as a discipline? What I've seen and tried to demonstrate with my work, as have many other conversation designers in the industry, is that the need for conversation design doesn't go away. It just it shifts.
Mm.
And like one thing I would say is that some of the so we created in the Conversation Design Hub, the team that I've been leading, the Center of Excellence. In the early days, we created a methodology. Obviously, we had to kind of rewrite some of that with the Gen AI flavor of conversation design, but yet there are many things that remain the same and needed no matter how we create the output for the user. So like the research still needs to happen, the strategy needs to happen. um and then when we get into the creation of these conversational experiences with large language models, the conversation designers and the content designer skill is still needed to shape that content that the model is creating in the system prompt, but then also in the testing. So, testing should, yes, we need to test for accuracy, of course, but we also need to test for the quality of the content and the conversation that's happening. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, that's kind of one point I made, maybe misconception that I had, and I think others had around Gen AI in this process, that it makes everything quicker and more efficient. And of course, like it's clear and evident that it makes some aspects of the process much, much quicker. It's quicker to get to a first version, but longer term, um, the time and energy and effort is still needed to get to a really good
Mm.
conversational experience. So I think that that's something that I've learned over the last couple of years. So I think, yeah, conversation design and so many design disciplines have changed dramatically over the last 2 years or so. Um, and it's been difficult. We've had to move and adapt, but there is definitely, I'd say even more so
Yeah.
than before, there's a need for that human-centered approach,
The stakes have
you know?
increased in a way, right? I think that's a big part of it. And I think a lot of people that if you thought your job was to get a specific piece of technology to work and you would script the bot, then you're in trouble and your job has changed because the technology has changed so
Mm,
significantly. But if your job
mm,
was to figure out what's the ideal conversation that we would like to have with our customers and what does that look like, and then you figure out how to create that, then your job hasn't really changed that much. Then you're just, like a carpenter that is using a different type of drill. At the end of the day, there's a specific thing that you're trying to create, and that is the design for a large part that you're doing. So, yeah, if your job was to get this technology to work, your job has changed tremendously. If your job was to, like, how do I help people through conversations with some technology, then, 80% of your job is the same. And now you just have way more interesting tools and stuff to work with. We've also kind of what you're saying is like the CDI method and that step by step workflow that we've been teaching people. Like you make a few modifications, but the core of it is the same. And it is, yeah, it's like, what's the ideal conversation? And that was last week. I had an important meeting and it was funny. I find myself, an hour before the meeting, maybe some people call it manifesting, but where you kind of find yourself sort of like saying things in your mind. When I get this question, this is what I'll answer. And it's like, and I'm realizing that as the human, what I'm actually doing is running almost like a sample dialogue in my head of what I want that conversation to go. Right. I'm even mapping out it's like, okay, when that person
yeah,
says this, or they might object, what could I say? What makes sense? And I'm actually designing the conversation. So that part of it
exactly.
is so natural, and it's the same, and
Yeah.
then it doesn't matter which technology you use.
You're talking about like how you would kind of pre do a pre-run of a conversation that mattered a lot and that was significant for you. I think that's really interesting, and it also kind of reflects this concept that I've been talking about for a long time, which is that conversation, they seem easy and intuitive for us because we all have conversations every day. But actually, any linguist will tell you that conversations are super rich and complicated and multifaceted, and we employ a lot of different tricks and hacks to make them successful.
Mm.
So it stands to reason that creating effective bot to human conversations is not an easy task, you know. It's not easy when it's human to human. Um and but sometimes we just don't realize that complexity because we're all language super users, as the authors of um my favorite book on conversation design, Conversations with Things, by Rebecca Avenho and Danya Diebel. I've That's yeah, a bit of a plug for that book. I've plugged it many times before, but it's like the Bible for conversation design. And I've, in terms of resources, like, it's something I've recommended a lot to the community within Accenture. It's been
Yeah.
so helpful and is very well thumbed. And loads of highlighting in my version of it. Anyway,
That's great, and that's like you said, something that you've mentioned before. Another thing that you've said before many times is scripting is not the same as conversation design. What do you mean by that exactly? If I got a good feel for it, but what's the difference between the two?
yeah, I think it's kind of this idea that uh, the conversation that happens between the bot and the user is actually, what's happening at the surface. Underneath that, you have like a whole load of research and strategic work that needs to happen, so that conversation that you script or that's written by the model is as effective and engaging as it can be. So that's what I mean, that there are tasks that relate more to the execution, the actual conversation that happens with the user, with the customer. But in order for that to go as well as it can do, you need to know who that user is. You need to think about the value you're trying to bring as a business. Um, you need to, yeah, do that deep thinking with a blended team. So that's why, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, that it's so important to get everybody together in a room or in a virtual room at the beginning of these projects. The technology side of the house, the business side of the house, the experience side, and bring everyone together to think about, okay, what kinds of conversations can we create for the customer here? How can we bring value? Um what are we trying to achieve as a business? So, for example, we worked with a large supermarket chain in Australia, who were I was more helping as an SME, but the team ran like a full week of workshops with a cross section of people from all over the
Mm.
organization to come together to figure out, okay, what is the next version of this customer bot that we're creating? What is the vision? What do we want to achieve with it? And that's tricky, and it can, you know, lead to a lot of these meandering conversations sometimes when you have a lot of people coming together, but it's so necessary to ensure that at the very end of that process you're creating value for your customer. So that's what I mean
Yeah, it's kind of like
by that by that statement.
I've called it conversations to be done, or like jobs to be done. Like, what is this conversation actually trying to do? And it's not, I think what you're saying, it's not to have a chit chat about a problem or maybe give an answer. Actually, what is the core problem? What is the core value we can deliver? And then how do you give the system agency to actually solve that problem? So it goes from a conversation to, what's the conversation to be done? and how do we deliver that? And that requires more people, more departments, more intellectual power in general get it done. But yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
where a lot of people flatline to stop there. So it's almost like, how do you go from conversation design to agentic experience design, right? Where you really start unlocking the value, where, all of a sudden the technological capability of the team becomes way more important as well. And yeah, unlocking that. So the conversation is a replacement of something else. And the object that's also one of the things that
Yeah.
I keep explaining to people is that the goal is not to have the most natural conversation or anything. The goal is to use elements of natural conversation to make it easy for someone to achieve their goals. So we're not,
Yeah.
no person speaks the way a good chatbot speaks. Like it's the same that nobody speaks the way people in movies speak. We're using elements of natural conversations to make it feel familiar and feel comfortable so that we trust it and then we get value faster. I think that's
Yeah.
kind of what you're alluding to here. So when we kind of talk about what all those things mean, like how would you then, because you probably find yourself explaining your role within Accenture, but also if you're at a party, how do you explain, your role to someone that is kind of outside of this AI tech world? What do you say then?
I'm thinking about an occasion where I was on holiday with a group of girlfriends and one of them started talking about chatbots and how much she hated them. And I was saying, and I've said to others, like, my role is to try to make these bots or like conversational experiences better, to bring that human-centered approach. So, like, in very simple terms, that's what I do. Um, and I think that, to be honest, I mean, ChatGPT has done a lot to kind of bring these experiences into the spotlight again, and this mode of communication. Um, it may have raised expectations, though, in a way, but I think I feel like it's made people uh feel more comfortable
Hmm.
in this kind of modality. But we have again, going back to conversations with things in the introduction, they talk about this, you know, bad reputation that chatbots have, which we can't really deny, as an additional challenge that we need to overcome when we're designing, which I think is fair. We have to work hard to ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past. But I think things are moving in the right direction, um, because organizations, and I'm definitely seeing that with our clients, that people are seeing the value of the focus on the experience, as well as the need, obviously, for the technology to make the thing work. So I think things are moving in the right direction, and also other design disciplines are getting on board, um, and getting more confidence um, in these kinds of projects and programs. So yeah, that's going back to my simple explanation of what I do. I try to make bots better. That's
Try to make
that's my
fun. We
role.
all do. So,
Yeah,
so when you're, when you started doing this at Accenture and building up a practice, like, what does that really take to stand up a conversations design practice in an organization like that? Because there's so many people that have been working in
yeah,
technology for decades, for years, design disciplines, clients across the world. Like, for you to then sort of say, you know what, we're building a design practice focused on conversation design
yeah,
altogether. What does that look like?
yeah. So I mean, really, like, you know, our team is small, like the core team of the conversation design hub. But what we've created, m- beyond that, is a community of practice around conversation design. Um, I think the challenge for us in Accenture is that Accenture is huge. There's, I think, I thought it was 700,000. It's now 800,000 people, which is massive, and that can be a really good thing, but it can also be a bad thing because there's so much going on in different parts of the organization that might, overlap. So what we've tried to do is like consistently build a community of practice where people can share and learn from each other. So we build like a common point of view. There'll always be variations, right? We don't all have to agree on everything, but that we are learning from each other and moving forward. So that it takes consistent effort to do that, I would say, especially when it's, something that's on top of probably your normal project client work. And then the other thing that I would say is that it takes generosity. Um, Fjord, which was the design
Mm.
agency I was a part of, that was acquired by Accenture. Um, they had this kind of motto called "bold and generous," which I loved. Because it's about being bold and courageous and moving forward into new um territories for design, but it's also about this generosity of spirit that, like, I really appreciate from my colleagues, that they take the time to say, "Hey, I've done something similar. Let me show you." Or,
Mm.
"Can they respond to someone saying, "Can I help with this?" or "Can I help with that?" That's really, really important. And building a community practice is really strongly kind of based on people being generous and taking the time out to learn from each other and to share what they've learned.
I really like that the word generous. That resonates. And how, if you look at sort of then how your time is divided, where you have client work and basically advocating and developing conversational culture in
Mm.
Accenture, like is it like 50-50 or is 80% client work? How's the division?
I mean, it depends. But I mean, like, but I would say, of course, like the client work is the priority. But then I would say that, like, without this community of practice, without the knowledge sharing, without creating a point of view and a methodology, we can't do any of that. We need an
Yeah.
investment to to push the thinking, to build the frameworks and the methodologies. So it's absolutely essential, I believe. Um, and then I would also say, there's a lot of overlap, really, in terms of building a community practice within Accenture and what we're doing with our clients, because many of our clients are also wishing to build that community within their own
Mm.
organizations. So we've worked with some clients around education. We've done some kind of training academies, for example, with Vodafone UK's design team a couple of years ago. We've brought our kind of point of view and inspiration to other clients. So there can be overlap as well.
Yeah.
And then of course, through the the actual hands-on design work, then the key thing is that you bring back the learning to your kind of core methodology and processes, and kind of say, all right, like a methodology, it's like I was saying to a colleague the other day, it shouldn't be prescriptive. Like, we need to be able to adapt those frameworks based on the client, and we do that all the time. And
Beautiful.
then it's great to kind of say, oh, you know what, I use this framework and I shifted this, that, or the other, and here's how it worked for me. So that's essential as well. um
Yeah. Yeah, a method should be about asking the right question at the right time rather than thinking you have the answer to those questions each
Yeah.
and every time. I think that's kind of like the difference. And when you try to when you advocate for these things to product teams and tech teams, like what are some of the things that you've learned doing that? Because I mean, I can understand speaking to designers and say, hey, there's a different type of design that you should be aware of. But if you're just dealing with, engineering, product folks,
Mm.
what's your way in to change their perspective and get them to see that it's worth to invest in this?
Yeah. Um, that's a great question. I think actually funny, some of the things that I've just mentioned that are the fruits of the community of practice can really help here.
You,
So, like a strong point of view around the value of conversation design is something that like is a really good I think is a really good tool to advocate and engage with audiences that maybe don't see the value up front. So having this point of view and showing examples of like what good looks like, but then also what can go wrong, I think can help as well. Like if you have a gap there in your process and you're not really thinking as deeply as you should around the design piece, then what are the pitfalls there? So I would say a strong point of view is important, but then like the methodology. So if you go in and say, I have a process here for this, or we have a process here, that obviously builds trust. And it also gives you as a designer, the confidence to be able to step in and get involved. So I would say they're the two things that are helpful. Yeah, trying to think if there's
yeah.
anything else, but yeah,
Yeah, it makes
just
sense. Like
yeah,
we've had clients where it's a, then the client, like the owner, buys into when you conversation design, but they're like, actually, to get this person on board in a tech team, we need to call them like a design engineer. Like we just need to add the word engineer so that they'll let them in, because otherwise they're gonna be like, no, we're engineers. We don't need designers. It's always
yeah.
tricky. So when you think about that, you got multiple teams, you got all these different languages, you operate in all these different verticals. Now you've got a
Mhm.
methodology to tackle these problems, but how do you make sure that everything is up to par without losing any coherence and anything in all the work that you do? Like, tell us
I
about
mean,
that a little bit.
I mean, I am obviously not the only person
Mm.
doing conversation design in Accenture. There are a lot of people doing really great work. So it's not like I'm trying to wrangle or oversee absolutely everything. I try to help where I can for sure. But like normally I'm only focused on, one or two projects at the time. Now they can be complex projects involving multiple, you know, design squads sometimes. But usually I can, more or less keep my focus. I think when it comes to um like the variety of different teams and industries and profiles of people within the broader community of practice. It's about just trying to keep open lines of communication, encourage people to, to join in the chat. We also have like a monthly meetup um, that where we invite colleagues to come share project work, or we focus on a certain topic, like say personality design or like designing for agentic. Um, so I guess having a space there for the broader community to connect is important. But I mean, yeah, like I think when it comes to just managing complexity, like there's just no avoiding that. I think in any organization, you just have to kind of get on with it and accept that there is a certain amount of, you know, especially at the beginning of a project, there's always a certain amount of uncertainty and a little bit of chaos, but then things just start to
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
sense and come together.
And with this change now in 2025, where everything, agentic LLMs, it becomes more important in your community that you've built so carefully, does that community understand that they still need you, or is there a risk of them thinking like, oh, actually, that's something else now? Which is something, that we found ourselves in, like, where you had to explain, no, that conversation design thing, that's still the relevant thing here for for what you're doing. Are you experiencing that too? And what does that fight look like? And then actually on top of that, what does good conversation design look like in 2025 beyond just, that task completion? What's some of the misconceptions maybe that those people have in their products that they're building, and how they're looking at this?
I think um there was a couple of questions in there. I think maybe I'll just take the last one. Um like, what does good conversation design look like? There's an article by Des Traynor, who's one of the co-founders of Intercom, which is it was originally an Irish startup, and they've done some great kind of thinking and publishing. I've published a lot of great content, more recently about conversational AI and generative AI, and he wrote an article about like what makes a good bot and a bad bot. And there's more detail to it, but he talks about a a bad or a poor experience or bot being one that like tells you where to go to do the thing, whereas a good bot actually goes ahead and does the thing for you. So I think that like that's where we're moving towards. Um, as opposed to what can happen sometimes where, what happened perhaps in the past where like there's a conversational flow that's been created, but actually it could have been easier just to
Mm.
send the customer to a web page, and yeah, so like where the bot can actually take action for you.
Yeah.
That I think that's what good looks like. And then there are a couple of other things I think that also, um it's beyond task completion, it's the experience. And I think personality is important now, and that doesn't necessarily mean a kind of quirky out there personality, but it's this kind of consistent voice and behavior that runs through the experience. I think that that's key, especially in this Gen AI era. Like, how can you differentiate your brand through personality design? And personality design is always an absolute staple on any conversational project that we work on. Um, and then, like I was saying earlier, I also think that we are moving towards more immersive and engaging experiences, as opposed to, these kind of flat, boring windows in the corner of our website. I think we're getting the right people involved to create better experiences that, it's not just about text, right?
Mhm.
There are lots of ways of getting the personality across. There's lots of ways of getting the message across. Um, and I'm working with some great folks in the States who are really kind of pushing the boundaries of what we can do with the design of these kinds of agents. So I think that's where we're going. And like, to go back to your previous point, um, like, are people pushing back against conversation design and the need for it? I mean, ha it's difficult times for design, right? Because, we're seeing budget cuts and, it can be difficult, to advocate for design across the board. But ultimately, and especially when you're investing so much in this technology, if you skip over the design part and you're not thinking about the users that you're creating these things for, then you run the risk of, I mean, to start with, failed investments.
Yeah.
And then you also, if you just whip up some bot and throw it in front of your customers, I'm taking a very extreme view, but you also, especially if you're using AI generated content, you run the risk of brand, brand reputation being damaged, etc. So,
Yeah.
um, like, I think that these are the, kinds of conversations that we need to be having right now. Um,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
remember we had product guy from one of the world's largest tech companies call, and so he said like, "The good news is we made it very easy for people to build bots. The bad news is we made it really easy for people to build really bad bots very quickly." And that's kind of why, you can do cool stuff, and it's easier to do cool stuff, but if you don't know what you're doing, the damage
Yeah.
it's exponential.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
always look at it as like an AI assistant, basically like a human. It needs to grow up and go through these different levels. And
Yeah.
it starts, at just like a little text chatbot, and it can do that. And then, tech and design is not that complex, but as it gets more functionality, design also needs to get more nuanced and more
Yeah.
advanced. And if you build that up, and the important thing is that you can't skip steps. So you can't just start with that super immersive thing, because then it's just very hollow. And if
Yeah.
somebody goes off the path you had thought about, the whole thing collapses. So you can't, like, you just gotta grow it like a human being. No skip steps, but you can do it much faster if you know what you're
Yeah.
doing. But yeah, the damage can also be much bigger if you don't know what you're doing. I think that's kind of
Yeah.
the way
And
to think about it.
yeah, and one of the activities that we also run as kind of more or less as a staple is something that was inspired by a team in the dock where I used to work. And they were called the Conscientious in Innovation Team, run by an amazing colleague, Jess. And the idea was that you would come together at the start of a project, and it can go beyond creating conversational interfaces, to be something that you use in any kind of product or service design project. But it's about looking at the unintended consequences. So, like,
Hmm.
what could go wrong in terms of the user and their experience? What could go wrong for the organization, and bringing the team, the design team, but also the client and the technology team, the business team together to brainstorm on, like, what if the worst happened? What would that look like? But
Yeah.
then obviously, how do we mitigate against that? And that's been really helpful and something that I think is super important now, even more important now when AI has more autonomy, basically. Like, making sure we have those guardrails in place and not waiting until it happens to kind of mitigate against it, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's designing for trust from the user's perspective, but it's also designing for trust from the creator's perspective, because you now also need to be able to trust what you created. 'Cause I think
Yeah,
maybe in the previous generation, when it was intent based, we were focused on, designing for trust, but it was only focused on the customer, more or less. Maybe on some of the business stakeholders that we wouldn't hurt the brand and they had to trust it. But now it's like we're facilitating a conversation between two entities that we can't fully control. So we also need to
yeah,
be able to trust it. And that only happens then through rigorous guidelines and unintended consequences, and looking at that from all those different angles, and then be like, you know what? We have everything in place and we can set this thing free.
yeah.
And I guess that the user research, and so on the one hand, there's user research, which I know you're keen on, and then there's the data from the interactions. Can you talk a little bit about how those two work together for you in your work?
Yeah, I mean, the user research, of course, is one of those disciplines that's been quite diluted. I
E
think in recent times, like, I know that UX researchers are struggling. It's struggling as a discipline. That's what I've kind of seen. But it's so, so important. Like, we have to understand our users and their needs. So that's critical in the design process. It can happen in different ways. And also, I think that, like, the what I find working with clients is often there will be existing user research, and that is a really good starting point for our work. But, like, it's so important, and it can take many different forms. Interviews, getting to understand customers, surveys, looking at the existing system as well is super important. Like, how is it how are our conversations happening within the organization and its customers at the moment? What are the different channels? How do they work together? Really, discovery is so important. Um, so there's that, and then I think, yeah, you were talking about like when you set the thing free, like I think it doesn't stop there. So either like the consultant or the client needs to be using user data to understand, okay, how's it going? Are things running as expected? What do we need to change? So the work doesn't stop at launch, basically. And there's
Yeah.
always uh, evolutions and improvements that can be made.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that tension, right, of doing like doing all the prep work and creating all the guidelines and doing all the research and doing all that work that everybody knows is so important.
Yeah.
And then there's like, just get something live, and
Mm.
there's no right or wrong because both things are so true, and there's just always that tension and conflict between them. But there's always like you want to do a little research,
Yeah.
set something live, take it down, then then sort of get to the
Yeah,
next step of more research.
I
There's that
know.
complexity,
Yeah,
and
but
one of the things. Hmm? Yeah, go.
oh, sorry, I was gonna say like, um, the two responses to that because I get that pressure. But I think, number one, the research can help not just with the immediate ask, like of an MVP or whatever it is you're creating, but can also feed into the future vision. That's what we found on a recent project for an employee
Mm,
bot, with a client in the Nordics, where the conversations that we had with stakeholders in the research phase, um, you know, gave us an idea of needs that we wouldn't be able to cover off in the first version of this bot, but could feed into what we'd shape in the future. So I think it's super important. And then the second point is, like, and it's an obvious one, but you know, sharing, like if you like, close the doors and stay in a dark room for
mm,
4 weeks doing research and you're not sharing progress with the
yeah,
client, then yes, that's good. They're going to be wondering, why are we not getting to like something visible sooner? So I think sharing progress little and often with not
yeah.
just the client but across the team is really important so they can see, okay, yes, this is important and this is we're getting somewhere. So I think um I think that communication piece is important.
Yeah, I like that. It's and I think it's in general, it's like oftentimes when so we have this whole standards framework, right? And we go to clients and we do like an audit and sort of see how they align with the best
Yeah.
practices. And the biggest problem you always see, there's always multiple issues, but it always ties back to the culture in the organization. And then it's about not communicating, not advocating, not having an internal meetup where people share their work. A lot of it's basically the organizational culture is the context in which people do their work and create these things. And a lot of times it's very clear to be like, okay, there's issues there. You guys need to talk. You guys need
Mm,
to respect each other's opinions. If somebody's been doing this work for 10 years
mm.
and they have an opposite view of yours, instead of arguing about who's right, let's assume you're both right and find a way to work together. And a lot of it can be tied back to that. And I think a lot many of the things that you're saying are have to do with, advocating, bringing people in, building a community, sharing, updating people,
Yeah.
communicating. There's like the meta design of a design discipline of like how do you
Yeah.
design the context in which the design takes place, which is kind of neat.
Yeah.
And what I, and as you were talking, another thought I had was, you know, the sometimes what you find we have that with a lot of clients we work with. They come in and say, "These are our numbers. We want to improve these numbers,"
Mm.
and they always take their default numbers as the baseline and then try to iterate on that. And but the problem is, let's say you're let me do this in the camera. You're right here, and you start to improve. You go like this. Where actually, with some fundamental improvements, you could start here and iterate from there. So a lot of times we take the baseline for granted and try to improve on that,
Mm.
and that's why I think it's there's two options. There's like three things, three ways of doing that. Is that one of them is what everybody's doing is clearly wrong, where it's like you just look at the numbers and try to improve those numbers. But what you're saying is like, no, you got to zoom out more because you need to look at the whole picture. Because maybe those people shouldn't even be in the bot. Maybe this should be. So you need to look at the whole customer journey
Yeah.
and see what you want to change there, or you go back one layer deeper and go to first principles. And
Yeah.
then, maybe you don't have to do the whole research, but you could basically look like, okay, somebody wants to do XYZ. How could
Yeah.
that work? But you get stuck in that, if you're in the conversational AI team, you only live
Yeah.
in the conversational AI team and you look at the data of the conversational AI team and you may be wasting 80% of your resources on something that customers shouldn't even be interacting with. And that's
Yeah.
like the trap that a lot of people fall into.
Yeah. I agree. And like the numbers don't always tell the full story either.
Mm,
Like sometimes they can appear to tell a good story, but then what's actually happening is that the conversation is ending with a frustrated customer. So, like,
yeah.
I think you need to take a holistic view, and I absolutely agree with you. I think what you're talking about there is taking a step back and looking at all like the complexity of all the different channels that are coming together to service the customer. So,
Yeah.
how are they working together? What happens when a user needs to switch from one channel to another? So there's one of our design leaders in Accenture, Nick Law, who worked in Apple before. He shared this concept that really resonated with me, which is the complexity tax. So as an organization evolves and expands, the technology stack, hires, the complexity in the back end becomes greater. There is a risk there that you would pass that complexity tax on to the user. So you make them have to,
Mm,
you make them jump through so many hoops to get to an end result, right? They
yeah.
have to explain their situation several times, which is the thing that people absolutely hate to do. So, how can we ensure that we are eradicating that complexity tax and ensuring that everything is 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 working harmoniously together. And like that comes back to the organization as well, like you say, because often they can be siloed and not, the actual teams aren't working together and communicating like you say. So the effect of that is that the experience won't be connected for the user.
Yeah. Yeah,
So but yeah.
that's why when we say, it's like an AI assistant, it grows up from level 1 to level 2, first functional, then trust, then behavior. It kind of grows up and gets richer
Yeah.
per level as you develop that. You also bring in more stakeholders, right? So if you're building a little FAQ chatbot, the biggest executive, he doesn't care, right? But you need to prove your value on the first level. You get more budget, you get more people involved. So as this thing grows up and matures, you develop that culture around it and involve
Yeah.
more people and more ownership
Yeah.
around it, and that's kind of how it grows together. And then I think that ties back into, what we say, if you look at the key KPIs for every conversational AI project, it's some form of automation rate, customer satisfaction, or one way or the other, and it's the cost per automated chat in a way, right? But if you're in the conversational AI team, we often look at those three and the cost per automated chat, which is a great KPI to look at,
Mm.
but it's only relevant if you also look at the total cost to serve, because you might actually contain a customer or you might lose
Mm.
a customer, but they pick up the phone or they go to the
Mm.
store. So these numbers don't mean anything if you don't compare them at
Yeah.
least to the total cost to serve. And I think that's where a lot of this complexity would come out of the shadows
Yeah.
if we actually connect those numbers as well,
Yeah.
which again is a silo culture problem. Because most of the teams you talk to is like, "What's your cost per automated chat?" "Oh, we don't know." Or if they
Yeah.
do know, then it's like, "What's your total cost to serve per customer?" It's like,
Yeah.
we don't know."
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And I think it's about being, obviously we are both in this field of conversational AI and, passionate about getting it to work for users. But there was this interesting story recently where Klarna, who went 100% AI, have kind of rolled back on that and are now bringing in more human human agents. And I think like that's obviously the result of them being very honest with like how things are going, and thinking, is this actually working for our customers? Are they happy? Are they getting what they want? And if the answer is no, then like we have to change the approach. So I thought that was an interesting,
Yeah.
U-turn.
Have you ever killed like a design that you really loved or a product that you really loved and that it got shut down because it wasn't feasible or was something went wrong? Is there anything that comes to mind there?
I can't think of one particular feature. I would say in general, what I found is that, I've had to, my team has had to compromise, in a lot of situations. So what I would say is that like we may have wanted to do like a fully blown discovery or research phase,
True.
let's say. But then, you've got to work within the constraints and the budgets that are there. So, you have to be flexible and find other ways to make it work. So I would say that, yeah, it's probably more that I've had to find compromise in terms of like what the ideal kind of project plan would have entailed, and then what
Uh,
we can actually do within the time constraints. Because there, I mean, there are always time constraints. It's rare that you get the luxury of, having a lot of months to do discovery. It's more like
but
weeks.
but if you look at the diminishing returns
Mm,
on that investment, say like because we show up to a lot of teams that have spent a year building something and we look at it and we make it much better in 10 minutes sometimes because there's just very clear mistakes. But there is sort of like so what is do you have any feel for like let's just say an average bank or telco, just like a context contact heavy contact center heavy operation where you would feel like if we get 100 hours of research, we're really moving the needle versus at one point it's I don't know, shows some diminishing returns. Do you have any feel for that?
um, so you mean,
So there's
making
like
the case?
yeah, so there's like zero research, so you're just in the
Yeah.
dark and you're leaning on your best practice. Then there's
Yeah.
that initial phase of research, which is very impactful. But then there's also a case to be made that at one point you're just doing research for the sake of doing
Yeah.
research. So it's like where's that? Where does it stop? Of
Yeah,
like
like,
what do you minimally need in every project?
I mean, like, you need some discovery phase on every project, I would agree, but it can vary. I mean, I think that in some cases, I found that you reach a kind of saturation point. So maybe you're hearing the same things in customer
Mm,
interviews, etc. So you kind of realize, okay, I think we've got all we need from this. We can move on. So I think that in those scenarios, we should be flexible. Um, but I feel like it depends on the context. So, for example, I am working with a team in South Africa at the moment who are have a really ambitious project around a financial institution there, and they are really going all in on the research and strategy piece because this is something quite new and quite ambitious. So it makes sense, and doesn't exist at the moment. So it makes sense to really lean into those initial phases,
mm.
and give them the space to ensure that we really nail it when it comes to the execution. So um I think that there's that to think about as well. Like, what kind of product or service are you creating here? Is it something completely new and super ambitious, in which case you need to do more of the research and the strategic stuff? Or is it like some optimization to something that exists and
Yeah.
maybe is working okay? It depends.
Yeah, and then I guess you've seen so many projects, and so many in so many different cultures and countries and different types of projects. Is there one project that you feel is like really like a turning point in your career or design philosophy, like something that really changed that?
I think the one that I mentioned in the doc, I guess, was the turning point
Mm.
because it was my, um, you know, open door into the world of conversation design, um, and really made me think, oh, wow, like
Yeah.
technologists, engineers are doing these things, but actually, this is a conversation. This is a human thing. This is content that we're creating. So that's really shifted my mindset. And then I would say that also the research project, the future of conversation at the doc, um, was a real, it was a huge one for me because I actually, like, with amazing colleagues, like, pitched that, fought for it, ran it, and it was a real, I think it was quite a career defining one for me,
Mm.
and gave me the foundations that I brought into this role as into this conversation design COE. Um, but I would say also that um, a more recent project, um, with a company in the Nordics has been so enlightening, because we brought our own methodology to that. We worked with a really great Accenture Song Finnish design team. Um, and what we found, and one of my colleagues is working on now, is like the content strategy piece, and that's what I was going to mention earlier as well. Like how important that is when we're using LLMs and expanding the use cases of a bot.
Mm.
Obviously, that involves more complexity, more different types of content, more content owners within the organization. So what Chris is doing now is working with those content owners and like setting up guidelines and a playbook around how best to make your content AI ready, let's say. And I think that that is a really important. I mean, I've taught that since the start, to be honest.
Mm.
Because um, I was thinking, as someone who's worked in content for 20 years, like I know that in most cases, um, you know, content is especially in big organizations, content can be a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
And what a content strategist would do is, go in, do the audit, figure out what's going on, come up with a set of principles, create a content strategy. And it's not just about the kind of the documentation. It's also like if you take Christina Halverson, who's kind of the mother of content strategy, it's more in the kind of web publishing world, but she talks about it's not just the processes, but it's also the people and the governance. Like, how do
Mm.
we ensure that over the longer term, the source data basically, or data content, um, is being approached in the right way. So I feel like content strategy, and I mean, you could say it's under the responsibility of of the content conversation designer. It could also be a separate role, but like I think it doesn't really matter. But I think that
Yeah.
that piece is going to become increasingly important because there's the technical work around getting the, the content ready for ingestion into the model, which of course is important, like all the indexing and all of that kind of stuff. But then, like we need to be looking at this from a qualitative point of view as well. So sorry, did I what was your first question?
Oh,
I think I
I don't
ran.
know, but you're answering the next question, so that's great. Now, if you're not talking a little bit about what's important here for conversation design going forward and kind of skill sets, and I think content is a big part of that as well. So we work with Raoul Bailey on and we made a part of agentic experience design course modules that we are creating, and I
Mhm.
think right what you're saying is it a conversation designer's job? Probably not, but it is the conversations
Yeah,
designer's responsibility to make sure that it is done properly
yeah,
and make and advocate for it and make sure that that's done because
yeah,
if that sucks, then your bot's gonna suck if you use LLM. It's that simple. It's kind of
yeah,
the better it's structured. A lot of the platforms right now, it's like, yeah, we have the technology to create great generate Gen AI bots, and then they don't work, and then it's like, yeah, it's content's fault. It's like, yeah, but so it's a you can't just point a finger, like,
yeah,
it's a fundamental component now,
yeah,
of being done, so I think it is a key thing going forward. Are there
yeah.
any other specific skill sets that you think will be, essential in this next generation?
I mean, there's so many kind of yeah, like there's so many different flavors of conversation designers as well. Like many like me come from like a content design background and maybe, have done kind of content strategy work in the past. So they lend themselves to that piece as well. But as you say, it doesn't have to be the same person. Um and then, like, there are other flavors of conversation designers where they're, like, a lot more technical. Like, I think overall and, like, I'm more towards the left for sure on the, like, the storytelling side, but I think the more that we can understand what's happening, from a technical point of view, the better. Like, it's kind of a role that I think is really important, uh, has always been important, but especially now is maybe in other organizations, but in Fjord, where I was, we had this role of a creative technologist to kind of bridge the gap between the
Mm,
technology team and the creatives, and like we had someone on at a project I worked on earlier this year, and she was absolutely fantastic, Erin. This was a little bit different. It was kind of like a more of a marketing project. But she really got the prompt engineering and was able to like do hands-on prompt engineering, but she understood the creative vision for what we were trying to do. So
mm.
someone who kind of has their foot in both camps, I think that kind of role is really important. That
That's
yeah.
yeah, that makes sense, and then kinda if if you look where this field is heading with some of those new disciplines, what do you see as the most exciting, like, as product opportunities for conversation design in the next, like, 12, 18 months? Where's this going? What do you think is, like, the
Like I
what
think what's exciting is that uh, we get we are starting to kind of expand the and remove that restrictive thinking around what this conversation can be, away from, like I was saying, the kind of the chatbots of
Mm,
yesteryear. We're bringing visual designers in to really like uplift the experience. We're getting, we're pulling the kind of the tribe together. So I think that that will help us to elevate the experience. So for me, that's exciting. Um, and yeah, it's exciting as well to see like, there's so many of these agents out there now, Claude, ChatGPT, that are really helping people in their everyday life. And the conversation that happens within those products is so important. I think that what I'm seeing is that these big players, like for example, Anthropic, they have a lady called Chelsea Larson, who's a seasoned content design leader. She is setting up the content design, uh, content design, I would say, slash conversation design practice in Anthropic. And Claude is one that I kind of bookmark as being very impressive in terms of the experience. So I think that that's good, that like these big players are seeing the value and the need for
Mm.
um the experience and the conversation within the product. So I think that that's good, and positive. I mean, you know, like we're just having to adapt and roll with the changes. I mean, that's not gonna stop. I mean, I just kind of feel like we have to be flexible and adaptable, and it's a little bit
True.
scary because everything is changing so rapidly. The world is kind of on fire, but you know, we
Yeah.
just have to keep going, keep trucking as best we can.
So then maybe we kind of get into the end here. Is that kind of where, what's if you look at how the industry is evaluating conversation design talent, like what is there something that they're getting wrong maybe about how they're looking at what kind of skill set they need? Because you seem to be focusing more on adaptability, where maybe from a world that came off of like scripting, it really goes to adaptability to these different contexts, multidisciplinary design teams, more longer term strategies, or what would you? I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but what's basically the main trait that they should be looking for to hire conversation designers, or maybe that they're wrong currently?
Um, I mean, I think it's not like if I'm not. I hope you don't one think I'm trying to avoid the question, but I'd like to kind of say, like, as opposed to the need for conversation designers and evaluating skills in conversation designers, which can vary. Like I said, you can have more of the content design type conversation designer like me, or you can have more of a creative technologist. So I feel like there isn't just one perfect profile for a conversation designer. And I think that you can bring different flavors and different profiles and people together. And that kind of leads to my second point, which is that yes, it's a specific skill, but we need to the other disciplines involved as well. So maybe something that we could work on as an industry is like the best way for these um disciplines to work together. And like we've been kind of figuring that out on projects. Like so for example, you know, we create like the happy path or like the ideal conversation and map that out together. And then that gives the visual designer, the UI designer, the kind of the basics that they need in their head for like what screens are going to be needed when, and then they can go off and then come back. And like, I think maybe it's something around, I don't know, um, optimal ways to work together
Mm,
as a varied design team.
yeah. So collaborative and adaptive are kind of like keywords almost.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Yeah, collaborative, adaptive. Yeah, for sure.
And as we're getting to the end, what's something you feel is true about conversational AI that very few people agree with you on, or very few people understand?
I wouldn't like to kind of presume that, nobody understands this and I'm the only one, but like, I feel like a little bit of a blind spot can be the testing, that it's seen more as something that like the technology team or the data scientist team need to do. But I think that it should be collaborative. And like, so for example, on the project I was working on recently, like we were working hand in hand with the data scientist. We had like a testing protocol. We shared testing documentation, um, and really worked together to ensure that the output was in line with was accurate. Number one, of course, that's important, but also in line with the personality that we had prescribed for the boss, that the conversation was flowing in the right way, that the content was kind of at the quality that we wanted. So that's a process that takes time. It's going back to my earlier comment, which is that yes, you can get to a first version quickly, but then there's a lot of work involved in really making it work the way it should. So yeah, testing
Yeah,
should be collaborative. That's something maybe
that's
people do know, but
that's a
I
good point.
yeah,
I I mean, launch is just the first chapter. That's kinda you're I think what you're saying a lot. It's like it's the
yeah,
beginning of the journey rather than the end, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And then, maybe as a final question, if we're looking 6 months ahead, what's gonna be your main focus or challenge at a sort of strategic level of what you're working on?
What I'm interested, what I definitely want to continue to do with the team is to grow this community of practice or a center of excellence. That's going to be key. That needs to continue. But then I'm also really keen to explore designing for agentic. So, like the agentic frameworks that are very much, a buzzword today, and super interesting. Like how do we design the experience for the user around that? What kind of principles? And some of my colleagues in the States have been doing some really interesting work around that and some key principles that we need to consider. So that's something that I hope to continue to work on.
Yeah.
But
So,
yeah,
figuring out this whole agentic piece, like from going from conversation design to agentic experience design. I guess
yeah,
there's a lot of people that are focused on that.
yeah.
And we're getting to the end here. I just wanna thank you very much for spending all this time with us and sharing your adventures within the big world of Accenture. If people wanna reach out to you, by the way, what's the best way for them to do that? LinkedIn or shoot you an email?
Yeah, LinkedIn is pretty is good. I can share my profile. But yeah, absolutely. Feel free to reach out. And thank you for this opportunity to talk with you, Hans.
No,
It's been
definitely.
really, really fun.
Yeah, and you're gonna be at our conferences, and we're gonna be all these do those things together. And everybody, Grace Hughes from Accenture Song. We learned so much. Research, 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 and get ready for agentic experience design. And do not underestimate how important it is to bring in the right people from different design disciplines, but also different departments and different stakeholders. It takes a village to raise a chatbot, and it's true first and foremost. And as we get the first steps right, we will be able to create more immersive and richer experiences. But we got to get the basics right, and we got to get the right people involved from day one. And the only way to do that is to tell your story, to be invested, and to advocate for conversation design. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.